What we're going to be going over today is how to access and use borders and textures in the suite. Now, there's a lot of stuff that we're going to cover today, a lot. And I want to first point out that I'm going to be using the program as a standalone, which means that I'm starting out in Perfect Browse, which is our browsing application. It's a way for me to find access to my images very quickly and easily. I'm not going to be going through any other applications today. So Lightroom, Aperture, Photoshop Elements, no matter what program you start out with, many of the things that we're going to do today, you can do with the Perfect Photo Suite as a plugin to other applications, but I find it easier to just start out here and browse because I'm going to be using multiple different modules all at once. And when you are going to be doing a multi-module based workflow, it's actually easier to use the program as a standalone. We built everything in here so that you can do it start to finish, which is really, really nice. But again, you can use whatever application you like. I just like to use and start out with Perfect Browse. Now, the first thing that we're going to be talking about is textures. And textures are a lot of fun, and they're absolutely amazing. You could do a lot of really cool things with textures. The first thing that we're going to be talking about today when it comes to textures is importing your own. A lot of people have their own textures or get ones that they have off of websites. Maybe they download textures for free or they buy them from their favorite photographers or photo editors. I know that that's very popular. So what I want to do is show you how to import your own textures and then how to access the ones that we have here in the Photo Suite. So we're going to be working on this image here, which is a destroyed camera. And I want to add a really grungy effect to this. So I've got my photo. I'm going to click on Perfect Layers in the top right-hand corner here. And we're going to be working in Perfect Layers. And one of the reasons why is because we need access to a layered-based workflow. We need to be able to adjust our layers and play around with them. Now, I'm going to flatten out and merge my layers because most of the time when you're working on an image, it's going to start out and you don't have any editing to it yet. You've got just one single layer. This is our photo layer, and that's it. Now, on the left-hand side of our screen, there's the Files tab, which is where you can access images right off of your computer, and then there's the Extras tab. This is where you're going to browse things like borders, textures, and backgrounds. There are two sections. The On1 Extras is the ones that are included in the suite. We'll open that up, and you'll see we've got our categories here. I can open up the texture section, and everything is separated down into different types of textures, which is really nice. So if you know exactly what you're going for, you can open up any of these categories. And then we also have our user extras. Now, these are the ones that I've included that I've logged in and imported into the suite myself. And they work just like any of the On1 extras that already exist. Now, I already have a couple textures in here. I've got some called my natural textures, and these are things like wood and dirt and rocks and so on. So these are ones that I shot that I use sometimes on my images. And I want to import a couple of my own that aren't already here. So to do that, jump up to the File menu and scroll down to Manage Extras. And it'll open up this dialog here. And you'll see that you have access to importing backgrounds, borders, textures, as well as presets. So if you're going to be importing a lot of things into the Photo Suite from your computer, you can actually do it here in one fell swoop. So if I have a couple of presets for perfect effects that I want to upload, as well as textures and maybe a couple of borders, I can do it in one round. I don't have to open and close multiple different things at a time. Now, for textures, we can open up that category here. And to import, just select the textures category and click the import button on the bottom left of your screen. It's going to open up this dialog, which will allow you to find access to your textures here. Mine are on my desktop, and they're in a folder called Textures and Borders, because I knew I was going to be doing this. So I put it on my desktop so I don't have to search for it. So I'll open up Textures and Borders here. I've got both sections. I'll open up Textures, And I already imported my natural textures. I need to import my grunge textures. So we'll go ahead and open that up. And these are all of the different ones that I can import from the desktop. So we'll just select all of them. You can be a little bit choosier if you don't necessarily want to open all of the textures. So maybe if I just wanted to open a couple of these, I could individually choose which ones I'm interested in, and I can go through and do that. So maybe I don't want to import this concrete texture and maybe this grunge texture. Those aren't really working for me. So we'll go ahead and open those. Click open. Now you're going to have to place them in a category here. And I recommend that you make a couple of separate categories. So I have one that's Liz's concrete textures. This is natural textures. I have ones from Photomorphous, which his textures are absolutely amazing. If you haven't seen Doug Landris's textures, you definitely should jump over to photomorphous.com and take a look at them. They're some of my favorite. And you can go in and you can add your own category. So we'll call this Liz's grunge textures and click OK. Now that we've got our category and we click OK, it'll process all of these and it'll let me know if there are any errors. If for some reason you imported a file that doesn't work, it's not good to import things like PSD files because they have lots of layers in them and sometimes can create problems. You want to import TIFFs or JPEGs. So just in case there were any errors, that would let me know. And you'll see down, these are all the ones that we just imported. And down on the bottom right-hand corner, you're going to see available in. So I have access to textures in effects and layers. You have access to backgrounds in just perfect layers. And then you actually have access to borders in layers, effects, and perfect black and white. So you can actually see where each one of these items is going to be available, which is really, really nice. Also, in case you import anything that you don't like I have Liz's concrete textures. If I don't necessarily want it in there, I can click the delete button. We'll go ahead and it's going to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing beforehand, and we'll click OK. And now I can remove that category or that texture if I don't necessarily like it. Now, once we're done in here and we click close, it's automatically updated the left-hand side of my screen. So you're going to see in the textures category, there's Liz's grunge textures, which we can open up and we can take a look at. And you'll also notice that Liz's concrete textures is gone. So this is going to be immediate updating. It's not going to take 10 minutes. You don't have to relaunch the program. It's going to do it automatically for you, which is really great. Now let's actually get around to adding our textures. We're going to start out by doing it here in perfect layers. And one of the reasons why is because you have a lot more control over what you can do with these textures when you have them on separate layers. And there are lots of really cool things that you can do. So we're going to start out with this texture here. It's called Grunge 3. And I have a lot of others that are definitely a little bit more finished, if you will. This one right here is a texture that I had edited and I did a whole bunch of work to. You're going to see a couple of others like my brick texture that I've done a little bit of work to. The color has been changed, the contrast, and so on, as has this one called Grunge 3 Edit. But this is what my original Grunge 3 texture looks like. There's a big difference between these two. And that's because I actually worked on the texture first before I applied it to an image. But just in case you didn't do that, you can actually continue your editing process after you applied your basic texture. So we're going to double click on the one we want to apply. And it's going to ask us whether we'd like to edit it as a separate image or whether we'd like to add it as a layer. We're actually going to add it as a layer. We're going to do all of our work here in one go. However, just in case you can do this, you can actually open up your texture separately, maybe edit it, add a couple of cool effects to the texture itself, save that copy file out as a new texture, and then you can apply it to another image. So there are lots of different ways of working here, and it's very important depending on whether you're a big texture user and you like to make sure you save your work as you go, or if you're the kind of person who just wants to add it as a layer and kind of play around, and you don't really need to worry about what's going to happen with the texture. You just want it working with your photo. So two different ways of working here. I'm going to add it as a layer, and we're going to do everything in one fell swoop. And we'll click OK. Now, when you add textures to your image, one of the first things that you're going to need to do is make sure that it's sized properly. So up on the top left-hand corner, there's something called the Transform tool. And this texture fits exactly with my image. You'll see that the bounding box, if I zoom out, is right along the edge of my photo here. You can rotate your texture by clicking out and dragging. So just in case it's not completely in place, you can rotate it around. You can also resize it. We're going to zoom out a little bit. If you click and hold the Shift key on your keyboard, it will constrain the proportions of the texture so that it doesn't get out of whack, if you will. If you let go of the Shift key and then click and drag, you can actually change the proportions of the texture itself. So if you want to shrink it down or move it, you can do that as well. Now, one of the last things that's really, really nice is, let's say you have a texture, and this happens all the time, that's much smaller than your original image. So we've got this tiny little texture and it doesn't fit with my photo yet. And instead of trying to make everything exact to try and put it into the corner to make it fit perfectly, you can go up to the top right-hand corner of your Transform tool and you can click on the Fill button. This will fill the texture into the photo canvas down below, so it fits it into your image. So just in case your texture doesn't fit properly or it's too small or too big, just click on that Fill button and it'll shrink it down. And a really good rule of thumb when you're working with smaller textures is, as long as your original texture isn't pint-sized, as long as it isn't this tiny little photo texture that's maybe a very low resolution, very small pixel amount, as long as it's a pretty decently sized image, you can upsize a texture quite a bit. I've doubled a texture all the way up to 2. So I started out with one that's about this small, and I've doubled the size of it to fit with my image, and it's actually worked really well. So just in case you ever run into a problem where your texture is small, you actually have quite a bit of leeway when you're upsizing it, as long as it's a pretty decent size and it's pretty decent resolution. Now, we actually want to work on our texture now. And so on the right-hand side in the layer stack, one of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to duplicate it. We have this grease stain that's on the bottom right-hand corner here, and I want to create multiple different grease stains around the entire image. So we're going to, in our layer stack, go down on the bottom left-hand corner and click the Duplicate Layer button. You're not going to see any change because it just copied over our texture layer. And then we're going to select that layer. With our Transform tool chosen, go up to the top right-hand corner, and there are 2 buttons called Flip Horizontally and Flip Vertically. We're going to flip our texture vertically and horizontally here. So now we have a grease stain up here in the top left-hand corner. Now what we need to do is we need to go in and blend these 2 together. I like to use a tool called our masking bug, and this is a gradient-based masking tool that we can access. I'm going to go ahead and select it on the left-hand side. And what we need to do is combine the texture on the bottom with the grease stain on the right, and the texture on the top that has the grease stain on the left. So once our masking bug is chosen, up in the tool options bar, you're going to select from the type drop-down menu. We're going to choose gradient. And then just click once in your image, and it will apply the masking bug. Now, there are 2 different ways that we can go here. We can either eradicate the grease stain if we don't like it, and that's what's happening right now. Or you can click and rotate the masking bug, the button right on the right-hand side here, and we're going to split it kind of in half so that we can see grease stains on both sides. Now, you can click and drag this around depending on where you want it to be. If you don't want it to be quite as exact, you want it to be a little bit more uneven, you can move this around. You can also use the dotted lines on the top and the bottom of this masking bug that I'm clicking and dragging right now to adjust the feathering amount. Now, when you're doing something like this, usually you want a little bit of a feather, but by dragging it out quite a bit and getting a large feathering amount, you can get kind of a unique, very soft edged effect, which is really cool. and you can move that around depending on where you want it. We're going to pull it pretty much right in the center there and drop it off. And we'll pull that back towards the center so we get stronger edges. And there we go. Now we've combined these two different photos together. And what I want to do is merge them into each other. So in the layer stack on the right-hand side, you want to keep your top texture, your top photo layer here selected, and click on the Merge Layer button. What that's going to do is it's going to merge these two texture layers together into one. So now we've actually created our own new texture that we can access. Now, if you want a more evenly spaced image that has grease stains on both sides, you can actually duplicate your texture one more time, and that's what we're going to do. If you click on Duplicate Layer, this time we're going to go up to our Transform tool, and we're going to go up and click the Flip Layer Horizontally button. Now, just like we did before, we need to combine these two layers together. So I'm going to go and choose my masking bug one more time. And up in the tool options bar, we're going to do exactly what we did before. Open up our type drop-down menu and choose Gradient, because we want to create that soft gradient between the two parts of our image. And we're going to click once. Now, right now it's separating the image top to bottom, but we want to separate it left to right. So we're going to click and drag, and you'll see that we can go through and we can choose where we want these sections to be. Now, one of the things that's actually really great about working with the masking bug is that you have the ability to add multiple different masking bugs. You also have the option of choosing different types. There's something called radial, and this is really cool. The radial masking bug is a circular mask which goes through, and you can create this really, really fun effect here. It's circular, so you've got a very interesting size that you can create, whether it be circular, oval, and you can go in and you can make some really, really cool effects here. Now, what we want to do is I'm going to jump up and show you the last type of masking bug here. It's called reflected gradient. The reflected gradient gives you a strip, which is what we're looking at right now. Anything on the inside of these two straight lines is going to stay the same, and then anything on the outside is going to be different. That's what we're going to use for this one. We want to keep a strip from our first texture in, and then we want to transition it out to our second. And that's what we're using to combine these two textures together so that we get kind of more of an even keel on both sides. So we're just kind of rotating it into place here and moving it around. And there we go. Now you can choose how much feathering you want, softer, stronger, whatever it might be. You can play around with this depending on what type of textures you're combining here. But once you're done, now we have this very unique, kind of a little bit more symmetrical texture, if you will. And just like before, we're going to merge our two layers together into one so that we just have one single texture layer here. So as you can see, textures are very versatile. You can copy, you can create, you can duplicate, you can rotate, and you can play around with them as they are. Now, the next thing that you can do is you can actually change how these textures look. What's great about this layered workflow here is that these two photos are separated. So I have my top texture and my bottom photo layer that we actually started out with. Because they're still separate, before I bring this image and blend it onto our photo, I can bring it into Perfect Effects and I can make adjustments to it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on Perfect Effects in the top right-hand corner. I want to make sure that my top texture layer is chosen. So we're going to click on Effects. And now we can make adjustments to just this texture. Now, there are many different ways that you can go with playing around with textures. One of my favorites is adjusting the color of the texture itself, which is really cool. If you want to bring out the grittiness or the grunginess of a texture, the dynamic contrast filter can be really fun. There's an option called grunge contrast, which creates this very gritty look on a texture. If you want to go a little bit lighter than that, there's an option called soft, which will be a little bit more subtle. I like the grunge contrast. I think it's really cool with that grittiness. And the way that dynamic contrast works is by adding edge contrast to the sections of your image. And it's done by going down to the detail section of the filter options pane on the right-hand side. So it's adding edge contrast to the small, medium, and large details in your image. So you can play around with these depending on how much grunginess you really want. So we can choose to go a little less intense there. You can also go down and adjust things like your whites and your blacks. So we can intensify the overall contrast by making the kind of slate gray steel background a little bit brighter. Or we could go through and make the blacks darker to create that kind of edgier, grungier look. And then you also have a vibrance slider here. If we want to go in and increase the vibrance or decrease it, we can do that as well. Now, one of the other really fun things that you can do to a texture here in Perfect Effects, so I'm going to click on the plus button in my filter stack because we're going to add another filter here to change our texture. Is on the left-hand side, there is a split tone category. Now, there are many pre-packaged split tones that you can play around with. Blue yellow is one of the ones that I use all the time. It's a really good vintage look. But what's great about the split tone is you can choose your own colors. And this is really fun. So a split tone is separated down into the color that's affecting your highlights and the color affecting your shadows. And each one is represented by a color swatch on the right-hand side of the filter options pane down at the bottom. So if I click on that little blue icon there, I can now choose a color just by clicking and dragging around that I want this to be. So we're going to make these shadows, let's make it kind of a magenta color. We're going to make it kind of weird. We're going to choose that pink tone and we're going to make it quite a bit darker there and click OK. You can adjust the intensity of the color by playing around with the amount slider here. So we'll make that really intense. And we'll do the same thing for the highlights. We're going to click inside that swatch, open our select color dialog, and we're going to play around until we find a color that we think works. So I'm going to choose a green, maybe like a lime green, and we'll go ahead and click OK. And just like before, I can play around with how intense I want that color to be. You can swap the colors by clicking on the Swap Colors button down at the bottom. And then you can also adjust the balance, so how intense the shadows or the highlight color are on your image. So we can weight it a little bit more in the magenta section, or we can weight it a little bit more in the green section. So depending on what you want to do, you can play around with your swap colors. Now the last section down here is your mode, and this is really important. This is how the colors are blending into the texture itself. Normal is just a flat overlay. And I love normal when it works on textures. It's really cool. It does change the value of your image, so it's going to change the tones of your original photo. If you'd like to maintain your tones, you want to choose something called color. It will keep the darkness of your shadows, the brightness of your highlights, but it'll still blend the colors into your image. There are also many other options here that you can play around with. Just hover your mouse over each option until you find one that you think works. Multiply is going to be dark and grungy and gritty. Screen is going to be bright. It's going to lighten up all of your shadows. So I'm going to go up and choose the color option. That's what we're going to stick with for now. Now the last thing that I recommend for applying to individual textures here are vignettes. If you're going to be adding a vignette to your image anyway, it's great to add it in through the texture because, again, it'll add a grittiness and grunginess to the vignette itself, and that's really fun. So we're going to open up the vignette category and add just a very subtle one called Big Softy on the left-hand side. It's a very simple, very basic vignette, but we're adding it to the texture itself that will eventually add it to the image, which is really cool. So once we're done, down on the bottom right-hand corner, we're going to click the Apply button. It's going to add these effects to the texture, and it's going to bring me back into perfect layers. And now we can actually combine our foreground and our background. So we're going to combine our photo layer and our texture layer. Now, on the right-hand side in the layer stack, we still have access to our original texture. And I like to point that out just because, just in case you made a mistake, you can always go back to the texture that we were just looking at before. If you don't like that weird magenta green thing that I just added to it, it's no problem. You can jump back to your original and maybe play around with it on its own. But for now, we're just going to hide it so that we're not looking at it, and we're going to work with our new Perfect Effects texture. Now, to blend a texture into your image, you need to jump up to the Blending drop-down menu. And from here, you're going to hover your mouse over the different blending modes to find the texture of your choice. There are many, many blending modes in here. I'm not going to go through and explain them all just because we have a limited amount of time to talk about this stuff. But as you can see, you can get some really cool results. The section that's underneath darken here, it goes from darken to darker color. These are going to darken your image. The section that starts with lighten, these are going to lighten your photos. So we've got lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. So these are making the photo brighter. The ones that are the most typical for textures are going to be overlay and soft light because they blend the texture into your image while adding contrast and saturation at the same time. And then if we hover through, there are many other options that are very intense. Some of them are very strange, like difference and exclusion. And we have a couple others down at the bottom that we can play around with. Now I'm going to go up and I'm going to use the multiply option because I like that darker, grungier grittiness. Once we have it set, we can also go up to our layer opacity and move that to the left and the right to choose how intense we want the texture to be. So maybe we could drop that down to about 70. And there we go. Now, just in case you still want to make any other edits to your image or your texture, because these are on separate layers and they're combined now, we can do that. So for this photo, let's say that we want to play around with the image, the underlying photo here. I'm going to select it in my layer stack. We're leaving our texture on top of it because we want to make sure that the changes we make to our underlying photo of the camera is going to stay the same. We still want to make sure that we can see the texture so we know what's happening. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my photo layer here. We're going to click on Effects, and we'll jump over and we can add a new effect to our image. So I'm going to go over to the left-hand side and we're going to choose the Vintage category and open this up. And we're going to add kind of a vintage effect to the photo. So I'm going to scroll down and choose Red Yellow, and we'll click once to apply it. As you can see, it's adding it to the photo, but we're still maintaining the texture that we already added. And it doesn't matter what preset, what filter you apply to your image, we're still going to have access to that texture on top of it because of that layered workflow. I'm going to open up the cross-process category here because that's where I was eventually getting to. Cross-process can be really fun. So you can create kind of a cool, very strange, surreal photo look. So I'm going to click around until I find the cross-process that I think works best. And I'm just clicking on each one of these filters until I find one that I think looks good with my image. I'm not going through and trying to find one. I'm just clicking and dragging. That's my favorite way of working here inside Perfect Effects, is just clicking around until I find something I like. Knowing which category you want to work in does help. So I knew I was going to either vintage or cross-process because that's the style of photo I was looking for. But again, just clicking around until I find something I like. Now, once we add the cross-process effect, down in the filter options pane, I can change things like the intensity of the effect. I could change the overall brightness here. So if we want to lighten up the image or darken it, I can do that. We're going to lighten it a little bit. I can adjust the contrast just in case we want to increase or decrease it. I'm going to keep it right around 0. and then the saturation of the underlying image. So we can choose whether we want to desaturate it and just apply that kind of weird cross-process color look, or if we want to maintain our original color. I'm going to desaturate the image a little bit because I like that effect. Once we're done here, I'm going to click Apply one more time, and it's going to bring us back into perfect layers. Now we have a completely new layer stack. We have our original images and our original textures, but on top we have our new edited versions. We can turn any of these on and off by playing around with them. We can take a look at our original texture and maybe start from scratch if we didn't like what we did to it. We can play around with our underlying image, whether we want to use our new cross-processed one or whether we want to go back to our original photo, depending on what we're looking for. And we can also play around with things like blending them together a little bit differently. So we could adjust our blending mode here if we didn't necessarily like what we did. Maybe we want to swap this over to darken. And I like that effect a little bit better. And now I'm changing the way that my image is working with this texture. So as you can see, there are so many different ways that we can use textures and images and blend them into each other. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is borders. I will be introducing you to the textures and borders that you have access to in Perfect Effects, but I want to kind of finish off this Perfect Layers section here to show you where you can access borders. Just like before on the left-hand side in your extras category, we're going to open up the On One Extras this time and open up borders. We have many different options. This photo here is a good one. We'll open up the film section, because we're kind of creating this weird grungy like cross-process look, so a film border would work perfectly. And we can scroll through and find a border that we're interested in. There are some that are going to be a little bit cleaner, and then there are going to be others that are going to be a little bit grungier and have almost a texture overlay. If you have your own borders, you'll find them in your user extras section. I'll open up my borders category, and I have a section called halftone borders. These are ones that I use a lot to create kind of a cool like pop art style to them. And this can be a lot of fun. Now, just like with the textures, if you want to adjust the borders, you can do that the same way inside Perfect Layers. Because they'll be on a separate layer stack, we don't need to worry about the fact that when we affect one thing, we're going to affect the entire image. These borders will also be on a separate layer. So if we go through, and I'm going to add one of the halftone frames. Got a couple in here, so we're going to go down to, where is it? This one called Dots 6, and I'm going to double click. We're going to add it as a layer just like we did before and click OK. This is a great example of a border that's not fitting very well. So I'm going to choose my transform tool. And the first thing we're going to do is rotate it because it's obviously the wrong orientation. So there are rotate buttons in the top right-hand corner. So we'll rotate it. And then I'm going to click the fill button. Now, when you're working with borders that may not necessarily have the exact same proportion as your underlying image, you may have to stretch them out a little bit. So I'm going to stretch these out. It's not going to make a huge difference to our photo or the border itself. So I'm not really worried about the fact that it's going to look very strange. If you do have a border that has something like writing on the edge, you want to make sure that if you're creating the border yourself, that it's the proportion that you're going to want to use on your image. I'm going to click on the apply button. It'll save that change. The border doesn't look distorted in any way, so I'm not really worried about that fact. And just like before, I can take this border and bring it into effects to maybe add a color overlay if I wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave it the way that it is, just because I wanted to show you here inside of Perfect Layers that you can go through and you can add a border. Now, there are many cool things that you can do with borders in Perfect Layers. I'm going to go ahead and delete this because I want to bring you into Perfect Effects so that I can show you how to edit and add textures in there. So I'm going to go through and we're going to hide everything that we've done, and we're going to start out with our original image here down at the bottom, and we're going to jump over to Effects so we can talk about that. So up in the top right hand corner, we're going to click on Effects and jump over here. Now, On the right-hand side of the screen in the filter options pane, there's a filter drop-down menu. These are the same categories that you see on the left-hand side of your screen in the filters library. This is just a different way of accessing them. So don't think that there's any big difference between these two sections. I'm just accessing the texturizer because I know exactly what I'm going for. So we're going to start out and choose texturizer right here. It's going to add a base texture, a set preset to our image. It's the cool concrete texture. If you open up the category drop-down menu, up at the top, these are all the categories that we saw in Perfect Effects or in Perfect Layers earlier. So we have things like metal textures, paper textures, there's photographic textures, which come with these really cool borders, and so on. Down at the bottom are the user textures. These are the ones that we imported, like Liz's grunge textures. This is what we imported earlier. So I can go through and I can choose a category that I'm interested in, whether it be my own or whether it be one from the suite. So I'm going to go up and we're going to choose metal. And we'll use one of the on-one textures. Now, once you choose your category underneath the texture drop-down menu, this is where you're going to find the ones that are specific to that category. So I can go through and choose whichever one I'm interested in. I really like the rust option on this photo. It's really cool. So I'll go ahead and choose that. Now, there are some limited changes to working with the texturizer here. You can only work with one at a time. However, you do have things like the ability to adjust the opacity, so the intensity of that texture, so how big we want it on our photo. We can adjust the mode. This is very similar to the blending mode that we were working with in Perfect Layers, but you'll see you only have 4 different options here. We could do normal, which is going to be very high intensity, high saturation. Subtle, which will be the subtle version of normal. Lighter and darker. So we can do darker or we can do lighter. Depending on what style of texture you're interested in applying, you can choose whichever one. I'm going to choose subtle because I like that the best. You also have flipping and rotating buttons here, so we could maybe flip the texture vertically if we wanted to, or we could flip it horizontally. So depending on what you want to do, you can flip that around and you can rotate it. You also have the option of adjusting things like the hue, saturation, and brightness of just the texture. So we could brighten the texture up, or we could darken it. We can go through and we can adjust the saturation. This texture has that orangey tone to it, that rust color. So we could saturate the rust even more, or we could actually desaturate it if we don't want the texture to have any color. So if you did apply a texture that you like the details, you like the gritty and grunginess of the texture, but you don't like the color, you can take the saturation slider and just move it over to the left. Now for this one, I like that rust color, so I'm going to leave it the way that it is. And then you can also change the hue. So if the rust is a little too orange, we can move that to the left to make it more red. Or we can move it to the right to make it more yellow. And I can just rotate this around until I find a hue that's going to work for this. Now I'm going to leave it at 0 because, again, I like the rust color. But I've got many different options here. The last one is going to be scale. This is the size of the texture. And when I move this over, it's just going to make the texture a little bit bigger on the image. So maybe for this photo, we want to pull it out just a little bit, and that's a bit better. So we started out with a texture that was straight out of the category, and we adjusted things like the saturation by desaturating it a little bit. We changed the brightness to lighten up the texture, and we adjusted the scale. There are limited changes that you can make here, but they still exist inside Perfect Effects. Now, when you want to add a border, I'm going to click to add another empty layer here. We're going to add a border to our image. I'm going to go up to the Filter Options pane in the Filter drop-down menu. We'll choose Borders. It's going to apply a basic border to our image, but we're going to scroll down. And I'm going to start out in the Category drop-down menu. You'll see that up at the top, we have all of the categories that come with the suite. And then down at the bottom, we've got user borders. So we've got our halftone frames that I was working with earlier. I'm going to go up and we're going to choose film because we definitely want to work with a film style border. And then we'll open up the Once we've chosen our category, we'll open up the border drop-down menu. And these are all of the different ones that we can access. Now, depending on what you're doing and what you're interested in, you can actually choose whether you want cleaner borders, grungier borders. There are many different options. I'm actually going to go up and choose one towards the top. They're called the 35mm dirty borders, and they create this super cool grunge effect. Now, one of the reasons why I choose this border to show off, or there are many others that I could choose here, but one of the reasons why I choose this border is you'll see that it's cutting off a lot of the image, as well as adding this white edge around the edge of the border itself. So we want to eliminate both of those. We want to make sure we maintain the largest amount of image as we can from our original photo, and we want to cut out as much white as we can. So down at the bottom of the borders pane, we're going to bypass the hue, saturation, and brightness here because these work the same as the textures. So we can change things like the saturation of the border. We can change things like the brightness of the border. Many different options here. I want to jump down to the thickness and fit image sliders. The thickness slider just changes the thickness of the border itself. So it's going to push it away from the center of the image closer to the outside. So we're going to scoot that over. You'll see it's making my border bigger and bigger. Now, I'm not that worried about cutting off a lot of the edge of the 35mm, so I'm just going to move this to the right until we eliminate all of the white. We're still maintaining that cool, like, cut out 35mm look on the edges, but we don't need all that excess shadow. It doesn't really make a difference here. So we're cutting that out altogether. Now, the other slider is fit image. This will shrink your photo down to fit inside the border. So we can move this down and down until we don't lose any of the photo. Now what happens is, I'm going to move this all the way to the right just so that I can show it to you. It's taking a duplicate of your original image and it's shrinking a new layer down. So the background photo is actually just another version of our photo. Think of it as two different photo layers, one of them staying the same and one of them is shrinking down. So your original photo is still in the background there. We're just shrinking a copy of our photo down. One of the reasons why this is really great is if you have an image like this one where the bottom of the photo is about the same, or maybe you're cutting off the left and the right hand sides, we can't really see that because it'll blend together really well. If you do run into problems where you've got things like lines, like this Mickey Mouse strap up in the top left-hand corner, you want to make sure that those line up pretty well because otherwise you'll be able to tell that you shrunk the photo down quite a bit. So I'm going to pull the fit image down to about 6, and that will work really well. Now we started out with a border that was cutting off the edge and cutting off part of our image, and we ended up with a border where we have no white around the edge, and the photo, we can see much more of it now. So both of these sliders are one of the reasons why I like using borders in Perfect Effects. It's because these options make it go a lot faster and a lot quicker. So we don't need to go into perfect layers and kind of try and resize everything perfectly and pull out, push in, and all that kind of crazy stuff. Perfect Effects, the borders filter does all of that for you, so there's less thinking about it. It's just going to do it automatically, and that's really, really nice. Now, once we're done here and we click Apply, we added our texture and our border. It's going to add both of those and bring us into perfect layers. One of the, you can call it a downside depending on what type of workflow you're interested in. One of the downsides of that is it combines the texture, the border, and the image on one layer. So there's one that has all of that fun stuff on it, and then underneath is our original photo layer with none of it on it. You don't have the separate workflow that we were working with earlier when we created our cross-processed texture look. So it is a little bit more of a one-stop shop when you go through Perfect Effects. But depending on what you're doing, that can be awesome. I usually do that when I add borders. I just go into Perfect Effects and do all those changes there and add the border in there because I like that better. But when I work with textures, I like to work with my images on separate layers because I play around with textures, as you saw earlier, by changing things like rotation, color, texture, and so on. So There are many different options when working with both of these, and you can choose which one's going to work best for you.